Hi, everyone. It's me, Tim. Today, I want to talk about game conferences. The way I decided to do this was I've had several people ask, oh, are you making a new game? Are you going to Kickstarter? Are you going to make a sequel to one of your games? And I keep saying no, no, no. And finally, one of my old work colleagues, they'd contacted me and we were talking about old memories and stuff we went through. And he just said, it's weird you're doing all these videos because you've never done anything like this. And I said, yeah, but I kind of got really into conferences towards the end of my career, and I wasn't really into them at the beginning. And we were talking about why that was. And I didn't know if it's different, if it's a difference in me or a difference in the conferences. But it kind of made me go back and think. I've only really worked at 5 companies my whole life, at least as an employee. So that was, Pegasus, which changed its name to Cybron, Interplay, Troika, Carbine, and Obsidian. Now, at Pegasus Cybron, I never went to a conference. I mean, I was 16. I was between 16 and 20. I was in college, high school and college for most of that. I don't even think there were game conferences in the 80s. If there were, I didn't know about them, and I didn't go to them. When I started at Interplay, though, in 91 as a contractor and then 92 as an employee, I was really interested in going to a game developers conference. I'd heard about them, but Interplay, it was like a pecking order, and I was too new to go, and I wasn't in marketing, so I didn't get to go to any of those until 94. I made a case. Hey, I really want to go. I'm starting a project. I'd really love to go to these things. So I went to GDC in 94. I took a ton of notes. I took so many notes. When I got back, I sent out an email about all the different things I had done there and the topics I'd heard and advice. I cannot find those notes. I remember sending the email, but I cannot find any of those notes. That was back when I took notes loose leaf, just random stuff. It might be in a box somewhere in the garage. I think I might have lost them. But I know I went to GDC in 94 and in 95. And then for fun on my own, I went to Gateway and Orcon, which were tabletop and role-playing game conferences up in Los Angeles. I met Gary Gygax for the first and only time in person at, I believe it was Orcon, probably 94, 95. I got him to sign the original Advanced Dungeons and Dragons DM's Guide. And then, of course, years later, I talked to him on the phone when I made Temple. I found that when I went to those game conferences, I really liked the roundtables better than the talks. Some of the talks were good, but the reason I loved roundtables is you tended to get 4 or 5 people who were experienced in whatever that topic was, talking about the pros and cons. So I went to a roundtable on adventure games. I went to one on role-playing games. At the time, I had no idea what the difference was. In fact, I asked, what's the difference between these? And somebody said, if you have hit points, it's a role-playing game. And I was like, okay. It was interesting because GDC back then was so small that it was easy to walk around and meet people and talk to people. They were tiny, just a few hundred people. It was all in one hotel, all in the conference rooms of one hotel. Usually manufacturers like Logitech and other companies they do a big, in one of the ballrooms at night, they do a big kind of showy thing where everybody had booths and you could walk around, and often they would just give you stuff. I think I walked away with a Logitech flight stick just because they were like, hey, we're giving these out. I'm like, great, which is perfect because X-Wing came out and I got addicted to that, and I had this great flight stick. When I left Interplay and went to Troika, I didn't have any time. So the entire time Troika existed for that 7 years, I only went to a conference once, and it was a GDC in either 2004 or 2005 when we were looking for a contract. I went there with Leonard, didn't find any contracts, did meet some people that I kind of knew in the industry, but nothing much came of it. When I went to Carbine, since I was a director and they also had a budget for it, I got to go to more conferences. I went to GDCO. In fact, I gave a talk there on how to do stories and MMOs. I might do a video on it at some point. I know people are like, "You're always saying that." And I'm like, I've got a huge list of videos I want to do. Um, but I remember what was really cool is I saw really big names there, like Chris Metzen from Blizzard was there. I saw Raph Koster and didn't walk up and say hi because I was like, "Hey, that's the guy who did UO and Star Wars Galaxies and all that." Um, I wish I had talked more at that conference, but it just didn't happen. Now, Obsidian was interesting because I had stepped away from doing any lead role there for a long time. So I found that I had more free time to think about games and try to get back into having passion about all this stuff. I ended up going to GDC 2012, where I gave that the making of Fallout talk. I went to Reboot in Croatia in 2016. It was near Dubrovnik, which is where they filmed Game of Thrones, and it was wild to walk around that city in the evening and go, I recognize many of these buildings and streets. I ended up going to GamerX in Australia, in Sydney, in 2016 and 2017. Did a roundtable in 2016, gave a talk in 2017. I also went to a lot of PAX conferences from from the time I left Carbine, but before I joined Obsidian, I went to PAX Seattle. And then I also went to, while at Obsidian, I went to PAX in San Antonio and the one in Boston a couple times. Really like the Boston one. It's the right mix of, it's not crazy huge, but it's not really small either. And because it's where the conference center is, it really tends to focus everybody's there. They're not wandering around half of Boston or half of downtown San Antonio. But after leaving Obsidian, of course, I moved up to Seattle in the middle of a pandemic. Really wasn't a whole lot of opportunities to go to a conference, much less go outside. So that's when, of course, I wrote my autobiography, which is never going to come out. And I worked on games and toys and things like that. And I finally was like, I kind of feel like talking about games again. Therefore, this channel. This is not a attempt to work up me as a brand. It's not to get anyone interested in a sequel. It's not for me to do a Kickstarter. I just kind of feel like, okay, things are winding down for me career-wise, which they should. And sometimes I just feel like there's a lot of things that I learned along the way that might help people, even if it's not exactly what you would have learned or the experiences you're going to have in the modern industry. I just think there's lessons to be learned. Interestingly, I did the GDC virtual showcase a couple weeks ago, and that was interesting because the questions I got were very different than what I expected, and I realized this industry is totally different to people entering it now, which makes me think that the standard question I get, which is, how do I get a job in the industry? I just don't think it's applicable for me to answer that anymore. I've talked about how I got my my first game job, by knowing all of the extended graphics modes of an Atari 800. I don't think that's applicable for people anymore. One thing I do think is interesting is there's been a sweeping change in the industry in all kinds of good and bad ways. There's money is focused more on fewer games. Because of that, though, we have a bigger indie scene. And that sounds contradictory, but what I'm saying is that there's like a squeezed out middle. There are far fewer mid-tier companies. There's a lot of big games being made with tens of millions of dollars or even hundreds of millions of dollars in the budget. And then there's a lot of indie. And there isn't a whole lot in between. There's also a huge diversity, which I love. There's also a lot of people talking about wanting to make games as a 9-to-5 job, which I'm less clear about. I've started and stopped 3 times now a video about passion, which I think is important, but has almost become a dirty word. Not sure how to do that video. I'll do it eventually. Trying to figure out how to get the right vibe on it, which is, I think it's important. I'm not saying work-life balance isn't, but there's just trends I see. And I know a lot of this is, old man Tim sees trends, but some of it is, you can't really work for a couple years and then go, I figured this all out. It took me 10 or 15 years to even feel comfortable and to get rid of that imposter syndrome that I know a lot of people talk about, where you don't feel like you're really, a member of this industry. You're just kind of watching from the outside. It took me like 15 years to get rid of that. And then another 10 years before I felt like, okay, I kind of know what I'm doing. And now after 40 years, I feel like I can go, okay, I think I understand some trends. Wow. So I started talking about conferences, ended up talking about gaming trends. I'm going to stop here. Just really wanted to talk about conferences and how I started out doing very few and then I've done more and more. And that led to this channel. So I'll have to do some videos on that work-life balance and passion stuff. And I may do my GDCO stories and MMOs, just run through that as well, and maybe talk about some things I still agree with from that talk and maybe some ideas I've had since then. But that'll have to be later.